So, yeah, hello everyone. My name is Dan Farmer. I'm an architect. I graduated from university, sort of part 3, about 10 years ago, and that was where I started my love affair with film and architecture. Currently, I'm an architect at AHMM, also run my own practice design farm, as Matt said. I'm on a personal mission, really, and that is to move away from the idea that architecture is presented as an A3 printed report in practice, that we actually start engaging with audiences and we utilize typologies and technologies that actually allow audiences to understand what we're talking about as architects, ideas of movement, narrative, time, light, process, all of these things we talk about. And then it just seems a bit odd to me that when we get to practice, that we still present static images alone in a A3 bound report, give them out for marketing, competitions to planners, and we expect the complex ideas that we've been talking about, that we've been designing, we've been developing as part of a wider design process, we expect those processes to be conveyed. So with film, we've been conditioned and we're used to seeing film over the years for the last, well, however many decades. As audiences, we come to expect certain things, and we can use the techniques that film and cinema have already kind of applied onto society to automatically engage with the work that we're producing. So here, just a very kind of crass example, really, but the idea of putting a vignette and a letterbox top and bottom will automatically set your minds associating with the cinematic experiences you've had in the past and start you engaging with it as a cinematic audience rather than kind of people just sat there listening to me sort of rabbit on. We're used to watching films. We're observers. We're inherently sort of born into this kind of idea that we have a fixated gaze, looking at a screen, willing to absorb the information that's going to be presented to us through the medium of time-based presentations. And as I said, as architects, we should be pushing these kind of ideas, these boundaries, and really testing and exploring. And this is what I'm kind of interested in, and I was interested at university, and over the last 10 years in practice, I've been working with various architectural companies and clients directly to really see how we can push and test and explore this relationship further. So when I'm talking about film, what I'd like to kind of make clear is I'm not talking about fly-throughs or rendered kind of time lapses. They have a place, and they, and done well, they can be very good. But in my opinion, that's best left to the visualization houses that have the full rendering capabilities to kind of take on the power that's required to make it fully realistic. What I'm talking about with film is being creative, telling an idea, selling an idea, I guess, is more important, and bringing the audience on a journey. So explaining the narrative, explaining the creative process. And it could be used for marketing, it could be used for competitions. Planning departments are now actually getting involved, starting to understand the benefits of seeing a film. So with a lot of the competitions that we're doing at AHMM, we're doing films to accompany them. So it's really kind of taking off in the world of practice that, there's an acknowledgement that moving forward, it's a worthwhile process and an interesting process, really. Clients are really, engaging with it, with app-based medias, and the digital realm. It means that they can actually take their film, put it on their project app, put it on their website. So in very kind of real practical sense, it kind of appeals to everyone down the design chain. What I'll do now is to kind of give you a very brief overview as to explain the films I've made. I've done a 2-minute showreel, which I've just put together, which kind of demonstrates a few examples as to what I've done over the last sort of 3 or 4 years with various clients. So you'll see work from my own personal research, you'll see work from clients for Google, you'll see work for clients such as Derwent London, architects AHMM make, and hopefully it will give you a flavour as to what we're going to be talking about today. So that gives you a very short idea as to the kind of films that I enjoy making, that I'm passionate about, that I try and explain to our clients and architectural practices that's worth sort of investing the time into producing. Today, though, what I'm going to talk about is one particular film. So it's a short film. It's about just under 7 minutes long. It's a film that I did some time ago now. It was my master's film about 10 years ago. It's a fully green screen film. It was being showcased at the Barbican, featured in AD and various other places. And what I'd like to do is take you through, first of all, I'll show you the film, and then I'd like to take you through the key moments, the key shots, to try and break down, because it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all fundamentally, it's, if you're all capable of using Photoshop, which I'm sure everyone is, it's all the same methodology, the same processes, and as architects, I really sort of encourage everyone to have a go and to demystify this process. To give you kind of the context of the film, as I said, it's only 7 minutes long. How it came about, so back in 2008, I was diagnosed with optic neuritis. So I woke up one morning and I was blind in my left eye, which was a shock. So I kind of had this moment, first of all, and then I sort of spoke to a colleague and a friend, and he said, well, don't worry, every cloud is a screenplay, have a look, check it out. So I did some research. I looked into it as a way of kind of just distancing myself from that kind of very real medical issue, and decided to make this film about it and incorporate it into an architectural research proposal. So optic neuritis is the process, is a result of inflammation of the optic nerve. So that's a picture of my optic nerve. At the time, the bright yellow spot is where the myelin layer around the optic nerve has been eroded, which has meant I can't see in my left eye. Now, the response to this, as part of the cerebral cortex, don't worry, I'm not going to go on too long about this, but the response to this is that around the damaged area, the neurons of the brain will branch out and make new connections, which is fascinating. It's really cool. And that's called dendritic sprouting. So you can see in the middle of the area in the middle, that's the neuron, the damaged area, you can see the neurons either side will branch out, and that's how we restore some function. So stroke victims will often have some functionality restored, and it's through that process of the brain rewiring itself. So if there's a change in the cortical order of the brain, then surely there's a change in the cognitive order, potentially. That was my kind of posit, that was my idea. And if that's the case, then my perception of how I perceive architectural space, objects within environments, that has changed also. Or can I manipulate it? So I came up with kind of three very kind of three base statements at the beginning of the film. And these are the drawings that accompanied them at the stage. So this is kind of part of the storyboarding process. So first of all, architecture could be constructed and experienced solely within the neuronal networks of the brain's cortical order. Well, that's what I said. Visual space is malleable, and we can manipulate it by experience. That's not too far-fetched. We're no longer talking about image or vision being an image projected on the back of the retina. That's gone. Those days have gone. We understand that it's all neuronal. It's electrical pulses going through circuits. Synaptic space, which is what I've sort of deemed coined this term as being, can be accessed through an architecture that's free from physical locations and physical characteristics. So, in a nutshell, that was my posit for the film Synaptic Landscapes. And what I'll do is I will play you it. It's just under 7 minutes. I always think it's good to know how long things are, so people I've sat through a lot of films, wondering when it's going to end. So.
In turn, acts as a semi-anode, recording edges, gradients and frequencies. As the devices of perception are not interested in light, nerves only care for geometry. They are stimulated by borders, boundaries, edges and angles. Cells are discriminating in their response, aroused by their own particular angle. It does not record pictures. Its aim is recognition, identification. It looks for particular spatial and temporal correlation, using lines and patterns as the index card for its search for clarity. Here now, these spatial representations are temporal, dynamic and continuously updated, definable solely as interesting correlations. All fleeting impressions are briefly recorded in new configurations. This framework creates a constantly changing internal environment. Only when one narrows in on specific areas of the visual field does its strangeness or the complex relations of one part of it to another become apparent. The fixated gaze sets the world in motion. The visual field begins to oscillate and pivot around itself, resulting in a chromatic instability. There is a battle between planes amid a web of internal spatial geometries. When the internal becomes one with the environment, the self is lost. Locating self becomes a Riemannian equation. The position of the body is known not by what objects have been passed, but how long it has been in motion. The birth of the manifold, details become incessantly compelling. An angle, an edge, a movement captured in all dimensions. They come out of nothing and they disappear.
Thank you. Okay, so that was a film I produced some years ago now, sort of eight years ago, but it's still, I think it's a really good example as to highlight the process that's available and still applies, the same process applies to all the films that I'm still making, even in practice for more commercial clients. So when I'm talking to about a commercial client or any client about the process of the film being made, we're talking about three areas essentially: pre-production, production, and post-production. Within the pre-production, we have the development, storyboarding, the concept art. It's where the ideas start kind of churning around. We then go into production, which can involve live action, modeling, motion graphics. That's the animation side. What I'm hoping to do here is try and explain or illustrate the kind of number of processes that will be going into the films that you potentially be making. And then in post, you've got the editing, the exporting, the soundtrack design. People often sort of assume that you can just put some sort of Mogwai track against it and it's going to look great, and it will probably, because Mogwai are great. But to edit and design a soundtrack appropriate to the film that you're doing it takes real time and skill, but it's really enjoyable and satisfying. There's nothing more satisfying than when you're sat watching the edit with the sound and it all kind of clicks. So those are the kind of processes that I went through when I was making Synaptic Landscapes. Those are the processes that I go through when I make a film for any kind of occasion, really. It's the same process. When it comes to the storyboarding at the pre-production, there are levels. I don't particularly enjoy storyboarding. How I interpret it for me is kind of just getting ideas down on paper. So you can see, that's kind of a clip of my sketchbook. It's just more notes than it is anything really. It's how I'm trying to construct the film or the ideas down on paper. There's a more traditional approach of storyboarding, which kind of illustrates what's going to be shown in the composition. And then finally, again, a snip of one of my sketchbooks, which is more kind of as far as my storyboarding will go, and that's how the film is constructed. Because to me, that's the kind of key. You can have the idea, you can visualize what it's going to look like, what's going to be in the frame, but you need to kind of understand how you're going to put that shot together. The chances are, like if you're like me, you don't have a crew, you don't have a budget, you don't have any kind of technology other than what is available, such as a digital camera and kind of good software. So if you want to do a pan round, how are you going to do it? Which we can talk about later. This is a still from the production shoot that I did for Synaptic Landscapes. As I said earlier, it was a fully green screen film, so all the backgrounds were drawings or part of drawings, and then so the challenge for that is how do you take that amount of information, turn it into portfolio or turn it into something presentation worth beyond the film. Here you can see the protagonist, Luke, who was my housemate at the time, who offered to stand in. The very real problems of doing a green, I call it a green screen shoot, but it's a blue screen. It's effectively any color, so it's green or blue, that has a complementary color to the natural color of our skin. So it becomes an easy process to key out if it's blue or green. There we had a challenge in that it was just one wall, which meant we couldn't do any full kind of standing shots. If I wanted him, if I wanted to key anything out above his head, then it meant he spent most of the time crouched down in that position so that the light wasn't too reflective on his head. And I think, for a 7-minute film, I ended up with 4 hours, over 4 hours of footage to kind of sift through, and then you create what's called the rushes. So you have to go through each take, monitor what's good about that shot, that whether you're going to use it, if it's in, out, maybe, and then you can create what's called a blue screen edit, where you kind of start piecing it together, start sifting through that enormous amount of information. It's really important to be organized at this point, and this goes back to kind of that idea of storyboarding. It's not storyboarding the end result. It's storyboarding what's going to be required to make the shot. What do you need? Because you've probably got one hit to kind of do this with the equipment and the premises and the actors or protagonists or whatever. You're not going to be able to sort of go in there week in, way out. So for me, I had one afternoon in the studio, and so I had to make sure I had everything I needed, and I went in with lists and lists of angles and shots that I kind of needed to get. It was diagrams like this that I found really useful. So this is just, I knew the kind of geometry of the room, I knew the setup, I knew there were going to be 2 lights. There's an ambient light at the back, which will just cast an equal glow over the blue screen. Then you have 2 kind of more focused directional lights that allow the subject matter to be lit up. And I went through every shot and kind of produced a drawing or a bit of text associated to that shot, so that I knew for continuity that when the protagonist was going to be bent down, drawing at the wall, the light was going to be on his face at the front. I knew I needed that light, a physical light for him on the front of his face. And likewise, when he was turning around, if I couldn't plot out exactly where the camera position was, where the lights were, it would have been a real kind of obvious problem, I think, later on with continuity. And there's a lot of examples and guidance on how to shoot in front of a blue screen. It's not, it's not too hard to do it convincingly. It's probably very hard to do it very well, but I'm not an expert by any means. But I don't think it's too hard to kind of do a convincing job. And actually, sometimes, serendipitously, sometimes the mistakes actually make it look kind of better, more interesting. So the process then of taking that out, so I use the Adobe Suite because it's available to kind of most of us, and naturally coming from an architectural student background, I was very familiar with the Photoshop suite and Illustrator. So After Effects really is kind of just a natural progression. It's a sister application to it. The interface is perfectly understandable, and you shouldn't really be afraid to kind of just dip in. Within After Effects, they have a plugin called Keylight, which is developed by a well-known sort of technical company called the Foundry Effects Company in London, and it allows you to kind of pick a very specific range of hue and RGB, and then sort of strike it out, as you can see there. So I've picked that blue, and it's fairly forgiving. So this is what I mean. You can see in the top left image, the blue, it's not a consistent light. So the top left of the blue is slightly brighter than the bottom right. That's not ideal, and so you can see that where Keylight's picking up. But you can manipulate it, you can change it, and so to get fairly convincing results, it's not too bad. The idea then behind this is to composite it into a convincing background, to animate. You're trying to bring the audiences in, take them on the journey, in the same way that cinema does it to mainstream audiences. You're transferring them from the seats, you're trying to bring them into the world of which you're constructing. The key to that then is this idea of compositing. So everything you're doing now is you've got, and it's the same whether it's a drawing or a film really, you've got a background, you've got foreground elements, you've got sketches, photographs, renders. We're used to working with multiple mediums, and actually just combining it all is the thing that is going to be the convincing selling point. And it's the same here. So here we're doing some color grading. You can see that kind of point I made earlier about the light on the subject's head. I knew that the drawing that I was going to be producing in the background, I wanted a shaft of light in the background, and I knew that I needed the subject to be in the foreground, so the point of light needed to be there. If the light was on the other side when I did the footage, when I shot him in the studio, it would have been obvious and noticeable and not convincing for the audience. Interestingly, I mean that's that's an interesting shot, that one, because there's a scene in the film where the camera pans around from that shot to a kind of a face straight-on view. So as I said, with the size of the studio, the blue screen, and I don't have the kind of crew, the technological kind of facilities that most cinema houses have. You have to think of ways to kind of get around this. So instead of moving the camera, we move the subject. So the camera can stay still. We've got perfect control of the lighting. We know where the blue background is. That's not going to be moving, so everything's going to stay tightly in shot. And what it meant was that I had someone sort of underneath shot spinning the actor on a revolving sort of disc, so that he moved, the camera stayed still, and when it came to the compositing element, the background could just slide behind him, which allowed it to give this idea that we were moving around the space and the actor was staying still, when in actual fact it was the reverse. So as part of the production process, it's the idea of the matte. So we're very used to and experienced and skilled at producing 2D graphics, 2D images, representations of space. This is all stuff that we should be applying and using and embracing in our films. So the matte is essentially just a background that allows you to kind of explore, and then it's up to you to understand and to take your skills that you have, whether it's hand drawing, rendering, 3D work, photographic work, anything, and using Photoshop or any other sort of program, I guess, to tie it all together, and you can color grade it, and that's how you start building up your environment, and you'll get a suite of these images, which we'll refer to as mattes, for example. That's kind of what they're known as. And you're starting to build up, really useful assets that you're going to use in your film, but also in your drawings, in your portfolios, and you just have this kind of really rich kind of asset library. In After Effects, there's a really powerful tool, and it's called light projection. What it allows you to do is take 2D images and project it onto 3D geometry. So you can get very convincing ideas that cameras can move within space, and that spaces are three-dimensional. It exploits the human kind of idea of the visual notion of parallax. So things in the background will move slower than things in the foreground. Let me try and explain it. So here, for example, there are 5 planes, which are just shown as grids, forming kind of half of a cube. What I've done here is I've positioned a camera in After Effects. So this is just a screen grab out of After Effects program. I've positioned a camera and I've positioned a light. The light and the camera at the point of creation were in the same plane. What I've done is taken my matte painting, which we've seen before, it could have been any environment, and I've applied it to the light. So the light will project my image outwards. And it'll do it through a shadow map. The grid or the planes themselves will accept that light, but they won't accept the luminescence of it. They'll accept just the shadow map. What that does is it means that my light source, which is now projecting the image onto that, is that when I move my camera around, the image will stay still because the planes are staying still, but the camera will move, allowing you to get new viewports, a new kind of experience within that space. It's kind of, you can't go far with it. It's not that you're going to be able to do 360. You're limited as to, because obviously you're limited as to the perspective of your original map view and the geometry of the planes. But to get very slight, subtle camera moves is all you need to give the viewer an idea of three-dimensional space and occupying that three-dimensional space. Very rarely do I have to move a camera very far at all, and if I do, generally it's probably causing more problems than it's worth. So here you can sort of see, this is on the left, we're now in that camera view. What I've done is on the back and the right plane is I've taken the image map off so that you can see where the planes are sitting, and then on the right I've turned the effects sort of control on, and it will allow that camera now to move freely within and get that view. So then how do we start, to kind of make this kind of convincing story and to really build on this, this narrative? It's all about adding smoke and mirrors, really, or just adding more convincing material, like you would in a drawing. So 3D elements, and again, trying to get real, here there's an example I've put in a bonsai tree, and you can see the method I was using to try and turn it round. A lot of it's experimentation, because you have to kind of make these moves before I've even gone into starting to edit or composite. This was the same shoot that I did with the actor. So this is, I guess, why I ended up with 4 hours. You just end up just shooting whatever you can for as long as you can until someone throws you out, and you hope that you might need it, or you don't. And then mixing it with three-dimensional, sort of 3D modeled elements as well. If you have skills that allow you to do that, then it's fantastic. It's very straightforward to composite those elements into the backdrop and into the scene. So now going back to that viewport, you can see here that the background's kind of turned off so that you can still see the grid, but you'll start to see the layering up. So in there you've got the green screen of the bonsai tree, and you've got some of the 3D elements sort of building up to form the kind of fantastical leaves and foliage that the tree is occupying. What's kind of interesting here, I guess, or the point to note, is that it's actually occupying a 3D space in After Effects. So the plane at the back, where the grid ends, is where the back of the shot is. So that's where the back of the scene, the set or the scenery is. moving the tree halfway down the room is allowing that sense of parallax. So when the camera moves, the tree's going to move at a different rate to what's going behind it. And that's really powerful. I think that's kind of the thing that's going to make it successful. And here is kind of a screenshot of how that scene was composited through the camera. The bonsai tree, the 3D Studio Max leaves, the mat, and then there's more 3D blue screen elements with the swinging pendulums, which were a nightmare, in the foreground as well. You can play around with other powerful sort of elements within After Effects, such as particles. There are certain softwares that allow you to kind of explore it further through 3D modeling packages. But After Effects have a really kind of simple way of doing it as well through trap code particular. What it does is, what I wanted to emulate was this kind of mist, which you can see in the bottom right of the big image. It's kind of something that just, again, reinforces the idea that it's a real space that we're occupying. So it starts off as these kind of big blobby particles that you can then turn into a mist and dissolve, and refine it. But it's those processes that I think make it that you want to be kind of pushing for to try and be as ambitious and make it as convincing as possible, really. One of the techniques that I developed as a result of Synaptic Landscapes was, so light projecting is all kind of standard fare for After Effects enthusiasts, I guess. It was during this film that I tried to develop a way of distorting that process and playing with an interpolation of planes so that you got moments of kind of distorted projection and moments of clarity. You can see here what I've ended up doing is putting additional objects in there, which are essentially planes or masked planes to inhabit that space, that cube, so that when the light's going to project on it, and it will cast the image map onto those planes, but when the camera moves around it, you'll start to see the planes emerge. So from that kind of golden viewpoint, everything will align, but when the camera moves slightly off, things start to kind of shift. And I guess it's kind of similar to the Channel 4 ident, which we're all kind of familiar with. So this is a screen grab of its construction. Some of the textures are applied, some aren't, just to kind of make it clear. And in the top right corner, you can see the effect. So that's through the camera and then through the screen. This is the camera there down in the X and Y axis there. So you can start to see with the light being in the bottom right, that kind of cylindrical object. So as a result of the camera not being in the same space as the light in the top right image, you can see the shards appearing and it appearing to be kind of slightly misaligned. Over the course of the film, then you start building that up and you start occupying that space and you start pushing it. And it becomes more and more complicated, but more and more kind of interesting as a result, as a viewer. So that's again through the camera. So we're kind of coming to the end. It's what you do with the information and how you present it. So I had the film as a product, and that was part of my kind of submission. But we also produced drawings. We also produced sort of diagrams and overlaid them. And this is part of my process of thinking of how to construct that shot. So this is the example actually that I explained earlier with the actor, how we were going to construct or how we were going to get the camera move. I wanted it from there to move around to here, but I couldn't move the camera, so we then had to work out how we were going to be rotating the subject, what speeds do we need to move the actor at, and what speeds do we need to move the background to make it aligned. And that was kind of trial and error, but it was really interesting, it was fun, and it's kind of worth explaining. It's the process of making the film is the architecture as much as the proposition. That's kind of the key point. So it's not just a documentation. We're not just presenting a fly-through. We're not presenting an idea and saying, well, that's the idea. It's the process of making the film is as much the architecture as the product. So there were drawings that I produced that explained the process. You know, I kind of like the idea that if I could, can I produce a drawing that I could give to someone in the room and say, well, you know, have a go, right? This is your assets, this is the footage. If I give you this, you're going to be able to get close to kind of making the film. You know, it'd be kind of interesting. You know, you should be able to get close to the kind of the end goal. But you know, I never tried it, but you know, I've always thought actually it'd be quite interesting to see how someone, you know, how someone else would interpret, you know, the drawings that I produced. And then like I say, so the drawings then become part of the architecture. It becomes we're documenting that process. We're explaining the narrative, and it's just I think it's an enjoyable way of explaining of the journey that you've gone through, because so often, you know, the danger is you do a film and you play it, it'll go on YouTube and you might submit it, but you know, it's not necessarily conveyed the process you've gone through and the work that's gone into it. So I think, you know, it's really worthwhile. The problem is like most of this stuff you need before you've done the film, and you haven't done the film yet. You know, so it's a vicious circle as to how you do it. But I urge you all to have a go, to not be, put off by the end results of films that you watch. There's some great websites out there, Motionographer, really good. Inspirational stuff for short films, for branding. You know, it's across the whole creative spectrum. It's not just architecture, it's arts, motion, graphics. But as a way of just getting an idea as to what's possible, and then not I guess thinking that you're not able to do it, because it's not that hard. I guess is what I'm saying. Okay. All right. Thank you though. Yeah. Sure.